Okay, welcome back, and I have worked all of my turns on my heel, and I don't know if you can see it, but I have a heel flap here, and you look on the this side, and you can see here are my stitches on the yarn, and here are my stitches on the needle, and I need to be able to. I've just turned, so I'm going to knit back, knit back on the very last row of my turns. And so what I want to do before I even start this process is I want to, because I'm doing the very last row, I want to remove my yarn. But before I can take and place it back on the needle, so I'm going to show you what I do to do that. First, I pick up each of the stitches using the end of the needle in the same direction that it already would be on. I don't want to I don't want to twist the needle so that my cable is the way that it should be. And I'm going to pick up all of the stitches, trying very carefully not to pick up any of the scrap yarn in the process, so that the scrap yarn will slide out with ease. And if it doesn't, then you just cut it. It's not critical mass, but it does make it easier if you haven't picked up the scrap yarn as well. And as you can see, this particular stitch really does not want to be picked up. In fact, there may even be two of them there. But I don't think there is, but it definitely is fighting. Okay. So now that I have all the stitches, and I'm back, you can see I'm back. So I use slip knots just so everything would come out with ease. In this end, I did a slip knot just so that all the yarn wouldn't go in. And since it's the end that has the yarn, it's usually the direction I want to take the yarn out. It's just the way it was put in. So I just pull until I no longer have the yarn, and my scrap yarn I can just set aside. So now I have the stitches that are my heel and the stitches that aren't. I'm going to pull this needle through, and I'm going to leave the loop at the other side, and I am going to knit across. I need to slide the stitch. Remember, I just turned it, so it's not a worked stitch. So I'll slip it back onto the needle, and I'm going to knit across to the knitted turn stitch, the last one on the needles. So knit, and that heel really does get in the way when it's pushed forward, doesn't it? Okay. Trying to give you a good angle, and it's just not working. I wonder if I do it and hold it, if that's going to get better for you guys. We'll try this, and if it's awful, I apologize. So, knit, knit again, and again. Push the stitches down a little bit to get them out of the way. And I am back to the last turned stitch. It's already been turned, I just need to work it. But then I need to do a turn, so I'm going to knit into those all three loops and take it off. But I need to turn this next stitch. So I just need to turn it, but still I'm going to pull the needle that came off, so as though I'm going to knit into this row here, but I'm not going to actually knit into it, but I'm going to turn, and I'm going to pull the needle out of the other side, and I'm going to lift the bar just as before, and then I'm going to knit into that bar, maybe, okay, and then I'm going to put that up onto the needle so there's 2 loops in that one stitch, and then I'm just going to pull the cable back for the stitches that I've been working on the heel, pull the needle out of the stuff below, and see if you can see this. This is now cable and a needle, cable on this side, and extra space because we're going to purl back and do the exact same thing on the purl side. So we're going to purl every stitch around to the very last, including the last one, which is our last turn stitch. And I need to pop them up on the needle so they'll actually come across. Okay. Purl, 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 purl. And this is the last of the turns, and the next round would be super, super, super easy. And we are almost, believe it or not, we really are almost done with the sock. So I'm purling the last few stitches here, and then I'm going to do one more turn, just like we did on the knit side. We're going to turn the first stitch on the non-heel side. We're not actually going to work the stitch, we're just going to turn it. So that one's been purled. Now we still need to purl wise, just like we're purling. We're going to pull that cable through. Now we have both needles. Oh, my locking did not work this time at all. So you can do for getting in a hurry. What you get when you get in a hurry. Okay, so I need to turn this, but I'm still on the purl side. So I need to turn it purl-wise. So I'm going to slip it off. I'm going to go into the bar below the stitch and lift it up on the needle, so I have the stitch itself, which is kind of tangled here. So the original stitch, the stitch from below, I'm going to put the needle in and I'm going to purl into that stitch below, take it off the needle, and slide both loops back onto the previous needle. And now we can turn, and we are done with our rapid turns, and the heel is complete. We now are going to just knit, knit, knit in the round until you have the height you want before you start the ribbing. I have found, I've tried doing the ribbing right away because ribbing does add stretchiness, and I honestly prefer to do 4 to 6 rounds of just knit, 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 knit. But you can do as many rounds and you can make it as tall as you want before the ribbing. You can do just a few rows and then do ribbing for inches and inches and inches. It just really doesn't matter. I am going to share one really, really helpful trick. You can increase if you need to, but I can tell you that there are multitudes, especially if you're using a bulky yarn. If you're using a thinner yarn, this is not going to be as effective. It'll still be effective, but it won't be as effective. So when you did your gauge swatch, you're going to know how many stitches around you need for your ankle, for your thigh, for your calf, however high you go if you measure. I wouldn't do thigh highs, but I mean if you wanted to go up your calf, you would know how many stitches you need around because you've done the math to figure that out. However, generally when you're working in ribbing, you want to go down to, I would say to go down 2 needle sizes as a general rule to make it the same size when you're ribbing. So I'm using a 10.75. I would go down to a 10 because there's a 10.5 and then there's a 10. I would go down to the 10 to work my ribbing on this needle, or even a 9, and usually I do. I usually just ignore the 10.75, even the 10.5. I go, okay, there's a 10 and there's a 9, so if I'm using the 11, I use the 9. If I'm using the 10, I use the 8. And that makes it, the ribbing, fit about the same. If someone has a smaller ankle than their foot, which there are people who do, then you want to go even smaller with your ribbing. It would be my suggestion. Just go to an even smaller needle. If a really smaller needle makes it impossible for you to use that yarn, then of course decrease some stitches there. But understand that the problem is that when you start doing things like that, then you may not get your sock on your foot if your ankle is that much smaller. But the big deal is when people's ankles are bigger. And the really easy thing to do for that is, if their ankle is just a tiny bit bigger, then only go down 1 needle size. If it's, and by a tiny bit, I mean like a 1/4 of an inch difference. And then if it's maybe 1/2 an inch to a 1/4 an inch bigger, then you want to use the same size, or one bigger. I've not gone any bigger, and I had someone who had really large ankles, and the only thing is I kept it the same. I didn't even go up one, and she said they fit perfectly. Because I think that your ankle is the ribbing is what's going to stretch the most. It's the stretchiest fabric, but it's also what's going to stretch out fastest. So if you make it too big, it's never going to stay up on their foot. So my rule is make it the smallest you can, where it's not uncomfortable, because it'll quickly adjust to the foot as well. So now that I've done my turns, I'm just knitting around. But when I get to my turns, which right here I have a turn here, I just knit into it like it's a normal stitch. Just 2 stitches in one. It's just 1 stitch. Just happens to have an extra loop there, because remember, it's just a turn. So I'm not knitting into 2 stitches. I'm just knitting into 2 loops. But I'm just going to knit around and knit around and knit around. And then I'm going to come back in just a little while